Okay. We began a new Masechta Avodah Zarah, and one of the unique features of this Masechta is that we start off right off the bat with aggadata. We have a discussion in the Mishnah about rules and regulations of dealing with non-Jews before their holidays. And the Mishnah and the Gemara goes into a whole segue based on literally one word, the word idehem, the word Eid, which is the word holiday, goes on to a whole tangent. And we have a very nice aggadata. I wanted to tonight look at just a couple of the aggadatas, as tempting as it was to talk about the first aggadata regarding the end of days and the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I want to pick up on the Gemara on Daf Dalid. Okay, the Gemara on Daf Dalid is in the midst of a discussion regarding, let me pick up on various psukim, describing how we will be punished, and the Gemara says little by little. And the Gemara right in the middle on 4a says as follows. It says, Mishtabach lehu Rabbi Avohu. I wanted to take a little snippet of the Gemara and make something big out of it, if that's okay. Okay, I'm about 2/3 of the way down on Daled Amud Aleph. It says Mishtabech Bahu Rabbi Avohu Lamine Barav Safra. Okay, so Gemara says that there was one time where Rabbi Avohu would praise Rav Safra to the minim. Okay, minim are non-believers, apostates. The Adam Gadol. Okay, they were extolling the virtues of Rav Safra to the minim. The Adam Gadol, that Rav Safra was a great man, and Shav Kulei Michsed the Tlei Sarshanin. And because he was a great man, okay, he was exempt from paying taxes to the government for 13 years because of his status. Yom Echad Ashkachuhu. So the minim wanted to see what kind of great man this was that didn't have to pay taxes, right? Someone who was so great they would have loved to met. So they meet him and they ask him a question. Amrule, they said to him, Ksiv, rak itchem yadati mikol mishpachos hadama al ken efkod aleichem es kol avonosechem. Okay? So what do? They want to test him, right? They were told by Rabbi Avohu, what a great person, right? What a great person this Rav Safra was. By the way, you should know Rav Safra, there are many stories about him in the Gemara, what a great person he was. If you remember, we had him last in Makos, at the end of Makos, if you remember, where it talks about the chapter in Tehillim, in that Gemara where it talks about how there were 613 mitzvos and David made it 11, and everyone after him made it to 7 and to 5 and to 3 and to 1. So when they quote the pasuk "V'dover emes bilvavo," I think from Tehillim Tezvav, it says, "Who's dover emes bilvavo?" And it says that's Rav Safra. So who was Rav Safra? No relation to the banker. Rav Safra was the story Rashi brings down from the Mechilta, I believe, that he was davening once and someone came over and was talking business with him, and he was saying Shema and he couldn't answer. And the person talking to him got the feeling that Rav Safra was playing hardball and didn't want to offer something at that price. And the person kept on offering a higher price. And at the end, when he could finally talk, He said, I'll give it to you for the price that you started. I just couldn't answer you because I was davening. Okay, that shows you the godless of Rav Safra. So Rav Safra was not only a very pious man, he's called in other places, the Gemara in Baba Basra says he was a Gavar Rabbah. So here he was such a great man that he was exempt from paying taxes. So the Gemara says, well, when these minim got to him, they said, listen, let's test your Bekias in Nach. So they asked him a question from a pasuk in Amos. The third parak of Amos says, God says, you are the only nation that I knew. Therefore, I will remember all of the sins that you committed. So they asked him, Mandi isle sisya barachme mesikle. So they minim asked, I don't understand what this question is, right? Excuse me, I don't understand what this pasuk means, right? They said that you're quoting this pasuk. What does this pasuk mean, right? It doesn't make sense because it sounds like God, right, who loves us on the one hand, but on the other hand, right? But on the other hand, on the other hand, has a problem with us, and he's and he's painting us. The word sisya is an interesting word. Let me look it up in Rashi. He says the word sisya is koes, right? The one who is angry on us, right? He says he's going to remember our sins, but on the other hand, he loves us. How could he love us so much, but then he's going to bring up all of our sins? Right? It doesn't make sense that he should be angry at us. So what is this concept that God tells the Jews that because he loves us so much, right, he's going to punish us for all our sins? The pasuk just doesn't make sense. So the Gemara goes on to say, Ishtik v'lo amar luhu v'lo midi. Rav Safra was quiet, and it sounds like he was stumped. So the Gemara goes on to say, Ramile Sudra Bitzavre. So the Minim took a shirt or some kind of handkerchief and they strung it around his neck. Okay? The Kamitzarule. And they were annoying him. They were pulling on it. They were trying to choke him. The Kamitzarule. Also, Rabbi Avohu came, Ashkechinu. So Rabbi Avohu said, what's going on? He met the Minim. But Amarlu, and he told the Minim, Amai Mitzaretle. Why are you bothering him? So Amruleh, so the Minim said, hey, Valav Amrlan da Adam Gadolu, didn't you tell us that Rav Safra was such a great man? But Velo Yadalo Memar Lo Perusha da Psuka, we asked him a very, very basic elementary question from Nach, from Sefer Amos, and he wasn't able to explain this easy pasuk. So Amr Lahu, so Rabbi Avohu told the Minim, Amar da Amri Lahu B'Tanai. When I said that Rav Safra was a great man, that was only regarding Tanai. That was only regarding Mishnayos. Okay, that's where he excelled. B'Kroim Yamar Lachu, I never said that he was a Tanakh expert. So Amruleh Hamid, so the Minim told him back, Maishna Atun Diyadutun. Hey, why do you guys know it? Why do you know the psukim? And he didn't. Amr Lahutz Rabbi Avohu said, Anan dishkachin and gabaychun, us that we're together with you, Ramian and Nafshu Ma'ayin. We always have to know these psukim because we always get attacked by non-believers, right? Like the old Dama Lahashav Lapikores. You have to have Tanakh on your fingertips and to understand how to interpret these psukim, right? Because it's just not right? It just doesn't make sense for us to get stumped. So therefore, we have to practice, and we have to have it at our fingertips. Inhu lo ma'ayne, but other people, right, who are not hanging around with you, they don't need to be an expert in Tanakh. Okay, so that's really where the story ends. And then the Minim say, okay, so you tell us what this pasuk means. And the Gemara goes on to say that he had an explanation about what the pasuk meant. Fast forwarding, so Rabbi Avohu says, "I'll tell you a mashal. What's this compared to? So it's compared to a person who lent money to two different people. One of them he likes, one of them he doesn't like. And the one that he likes, right? He says, okay, pay me back a little bit, a little bit, a little bit to make it easier on the payment plan. But the one who he hates, he says, you know what, you pay me back right away, right? So therefore, he makes it more difficult on him. So what does this have to do with anything? So the nimshal is just like that. So God, because he loves us, so therefore he punishes us for our sins little by little in order to make it easier on us. So that's the agadic part. What struck me, what struck me was, first of all, let's just talk about the first question is how did this whole Gemara start? It started off by Rabbi Avohu, right, was singing the praises of Rav Safra. So let's ask a very basic elementary question. The question is, and the Chida actually asks this question, he says, isn't there a problem of talking about someone even good, right? The Gemara actually says, "La'olam yisaper adam b'shvacho shel chavero, shemitoch tovaso balaraso ulignoso." Right? This is a Gemara in Erechin. Right? Remember the story of Miriam and Lashon Hara? They didn't really say anything bad per se about Moshe. They said something good. They said, "Look what a great man he is." Right? They talked about how he separated from his wife. So the problem, well, what we learn from there is that what? Is that after a while, you're going to say all good things, and then someone will say, yeah, but you know what? He's great, but, and then the bad stuff comes out. So that's, something you really want to avoid. So that's, a question that is asked on this specific sugya. And the Iyun Yaakov, right, says, well, he had to praise him because after all, he wanted to exempt him from taxes. So that's one explanation. The other explanation I saw, well, actually no. So excuse me. So that's one answer I saw. Okay, on how he was able to say what a great person he was. Okay, so one other comment that I saw from, I forgot who it was. No, okay, that was something else. The other item I wanted to talk about, which is a very, very big question, is are you telling me that a great person like Rav Safra did not know a pasuk in Amos? Right? That's really one of the that's really one of the troubling issues from this is how is it possible that Rabbi Avohu said Rav Safra only knew Mishnayos, right? Leave him out of Tanakh. So do we take that literally, or was that really not an answer? So there's an interpretation on the Iyun Yaakov. His name was Rabbi Chaim Yitzchak ben Yehuda Leib Rappaport, lived in Vilna. He was called the Eine Yitzchak, and he wrote a commentary on the Iyun Yaakov, on the Ein Yaakov. The Ein Yaakov is basically a summary of all the aggadata from the Gemara. It picks all the aggadata from a specific Gemara and singles that out, and the Ein Yaakov brings it down and discusses the aggadata, and there's various mefarshim on it. So on this particular aggadata, the Eine Yitzchak he says, Shechazal lo ratzu lihisasek kol kach b'tanach v'liyos b'kiyan b'pshat hapsukim. Kiban she'ikar askam haya b'dvarim hanogin lahalacha l'maisa. So believe it or not, he's of the opinion to take this Gemara literally. That with all their time on their hands, all these Amoraim, right, had to focus on what we call Lamaisa. And Lamaisa is knowing the laws, the Shulchan Aruch, how to paskin, and just knowing Psukim in Tanakh, while it was nice, was not their strong point, and therefore they had to spend all their time on halacha l'maisa. Okay, and he brings down a very famous Gemara that we're going to talk about now. And I'm glad we're talking about this Gemara because this is one of the Gemaras that I wanted to talk about a year and a half ago. I was away though. I was actually, this was a Gemara that I was away uh, in Africa for. So I missed that week at the end of 2023 when we were doing Baba Kama. There's a Gemara on Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis. All right, let's open it up. The Gemara digresses from a discussion about animals. Okay, the discussion is comparing the word behemtecha about having your animals not do work, okay, on Shabbos, and it talks about the difference between the first dibros and the second dibros. Okay, it says v'chol behemtecha. Okay, it doesn't say that in the dibros achronos regarding Shabbos, and then the Gemara made a statement. If you're following at home, I am in Bava Kama Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis, the last line, 54b on the bottom. Sha'al Rabbi Chanina ben Agil es Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Asks Rabbi Chanina ben Agil, Mipnei ma b'dibros harishonos lo nemar behen tov, u'b'dibros ha'achronos nemar behem tov. He wants to know, the pasuk says, let me just get this exact pasuk. It says Laman Yitavlach. When it says by Kaberes Avicha Vesimecha, it says Laman Yarichun Yamecha in Parshas Yisro. But if you look in Parshas Veschanan, okay, I'm going to bring it up right now. Sorry about that. Let me get you the exact pasuk. It says, "Kaveres avicha v'simecha kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha loman ya'arichun yamecha u'lema'an yitavlach al hadama asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach." That's the dibra those are the Aseres dibros in Veschanan. When it's quoted in Yisro, it says Laman Yarichon Yamecha Al Hadama Asher Hashem Elokecha Nosen Lach. It doesn't say Ulaman Yitavlach. Okay, so that's an interesting point that we may not have picked up over the years, but believe it or not, the Gemara asks this question. Okay, and the Gemara asks it in a funny way, of one rabbi asking another rabbi. Okay. He wants to know, Rabbi Chanina asked Rabbi Chia, why does it say L'man Yitavlach only in Parshas Veschanan when the Aseres Dibros are repeated? That's the question. Amar lo. So he replied back, Ad she'ata sho'alani lama ne'emar behem tov, sha'alani im ne'emar behem tov, im lav. She'eni yodea im ne'emar behem tov im lav. He says, you're asking a great question. Are you raising your hand? Deborah, are you raising your hand? No. Okay. So he says, you're asking a question assuming that I even know what you're talking about. Says Rab Chia, let me just get the name right. Says Rab Chia bar Abba, I don't even know if you're correct in your assumption that it says Yitav in Veschanan and not in Yisro. I can't even answer why it's different because I don't even know that it is different. That's a startling comment. Okay? I have advice to you, says Rab Chia, says Rab Chanina, go to Rabbi Tanchum, Shahaya Ragil Etzel Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Shahaya Baki ba'agada. You go to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. His forte was aggadata, and I'm sure he could help you with an answer. So Azal Agabe, so the one who asked this question goes over to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Amalei mimena lo shamati. He says, I don't know the answer. Elakach Amrli Shmuel bar Nachum achi imo shel Rav Acha, but Rabbi Chanina v'amri la abi imo shel Rav Acha Rav Chanina. I heard from someone, we don't even know who he heard it from. Hoil the sofan lehishtaber. The reason why Laman Yitav never made it to the first Aseres Hadibros because they were going to be broken, as we know. Says the Gemara, okay, so what? V'chisofan lehishtaber my have. Okay, big deal. Rav Ashi, no, chas v'shalom paska tova mi Yisrael. It says Rav Ashi offers an explanation that closes out this aggadata. It says, you know why? Because if the Laman Yitav would have been on those tablets that were smashed, that would have been the end for eternal goodness in the Jewish people. Okay? That is, that is the end of that aggadata. So many commentators jump, literally, jump on this Gemara and say, are you serious? Are you telling me that there's an Amora? Now, keep in mind, I forgot who says it. I think it's the Ram. I don't know, someone with a lot of authority says that if you were lucky enough to be mentioned in the Gemara and you're an Amora, you had miraculous capabilities. You could do Tchias HaMesim and all of these names that we read on an everyday basis, all these Amoraim and these Tanaim were on a level that we can't relate to. They were angelic. Now, sure, they sin sometimes, and there's all kinds of stories, and like we get mixed messages, but pretty much it's unanimous that if you appear in the Gemara as an opinion, you've made it. So it's very hard to believe, says the Pnei Yehoshua. I'm going to read this Pnei Yehoshua because the Pnei Yehoshua put this Gemara on the map. Okay, where he discusses this question. And he says, now, obviously, there's two ways you could look at this. Do we take this Gemara literally? Okay. Or do we take it? No, of course he knew it, but he just didn't want to answer, right? You could see already that, sometimes there's a way to explain a Gemara, right? Literally. And sometimes, you have to read between the lines. So let me open up Pnei Yehoshua, and he discusses this. So, one second. So he says, "Hine kol hakora yishtomem." Anyone who's reading this should be wondering, should be literally means silent. Al kacha v'chi gavra rabba kerabchia barab lo havi yodea chalila ma shinokus shel beis rabban yodim. Right, this is fifth or sixth grade level. Not to know a pasuk. It's one thing we were just talking about a pasuk in Amos. Okay, you can't explain a pasuk in Amos. Most people don't learn Amos, right, until you're, I don't know, till you're maybe in 11th or 12th grade. But to learn, Chumash, to learn Parshas Dvar and Parshas Yisro, right? That's, what we would call today fifth or sixth grade. So how is it possible, asked the Pnei Yehoshua, Shalom or Dibros Harishonos or Bachonos Ksiv, V'imishum dolashon tov mamash lo ksiv. So if you're going to say, well, remember what the question was? How come it doesn't say tov? Well, technically, it doesn't say, it says yitav, right? Not the word tov. So maybe if that's what you're bothered with, says it Pnei Yehoshua, Amai Kamar She'ena Yodeh. So then why did he say, I don't know? Okay. V'hanir le'ezdaiti le'yashev b'inyan zektsas al das hadrash, says the Pnei Yehoshua. And why I like this Pnei Yehoshua a lot is because it's very academic. It teaches us something that we wouldn't know about the Dibros Harishonos versus the Dibros Ha'achronos, because there are differences on the Aseres HaDibros, right? So are you going to say, well, do you just chalk it up to the fact that Devarim is different? Right? We know, we've been through Daf Yomi world, we know that the Gemara discusses a lot when things are mentioned in Parshas Devarim, right? Excuse me, in Sefer Devarim, which is called Mishnah Torah. The reason why it's called Mishnah Torah is because it repeats a lot of what is said throughout the first four books, right? For example, Parshas Kitetse, most of the 76 mitzvos are duplicates from Mishpatim and from other parshios, right? So we have a lot of things that are repeated. So how do we deal with the fact that that the Aseres HaDibros are repeated? So he says, Mishum dematzino demashen ishtanu hadibros hachronis bin harishonos bahar bedvarim, the fact that the dibros are different, mikama ta'amim shonim. There's many reasons. Ha'echad, one of them, the osan shenemar b'parshas Yisro, heinein shenemar b'sinai mipnei hagvura. So the first thing he teaches us is that we know that the first Aseres HaDibros were said by the words of God at Har Sinai. V'osan shenemar b'parshas Veschanan, the ones that appear later in Parshas Veschanan, hen shenishnu ba'arvas Moav mipi Moshe, kumo kol Mishnah Torah. The Pnei Yehoshua claims that those that are mentioned in Parshas Veschanan were those that were repeated in Arvas Moav from Moshe, just like the rest of Sefer Devarim. V'harbe Devarim matzino b'shinui lashon b'Mishnah Torah. Right? A lot of things are repeated, but with a little bit different language in Sefer Dvarim. B'sipurei hamaisim utfilav shel Moshe, v'divrei HaKadosh Baruch Hu el Moshe. Even take, for example, last week's Parsha Shlach, for example, right? It's obviously the story of the Meraglim is in Shlach, but when you go to Parshas Dvarim, you'll see that the story is retold, but there's a little bit change of lashon. Different words are used. The story is a little bit different. So you have like a different act. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind every time you learn Sefer Dvarim. Very, very important to understand how we deal with Sefer Dvarim. Okay, these are like elementary things that, like a good Parsha Shir will cover, right? The differences in Sefer Dvarim as opposed to the first four books. And by the way, we have different klalim also when it comes to a klalu prat and all these other techniques that the Gemara uses, right, to analyze. We have different rules just for Sefer Dvarim. Okay, so you have to know that also. So, Ubinyanei HaMitzvahs Ruban Kekula Nichtavu b'Mishnah Torah b'Shinoi Halashon. When it comes to Dvarim, everything is different. V'im ken kamo ken ein litmoa ala dibros shenishtanu b'hen halashono. So the Pnei Yehoshua says it's no wonder that just like everything else is different in Dvarim, so too the Aseres HaDibros should be different in Dvarim. Nimtza lefi ze lo namru hadibros mipi hagvura ela pa'amachas. So therefore, the real Aseres HaDibros were said only once, the first time, Vehem Harishonim. Avol b'midrashim matzino lahedya shezachar v'shamor v'shav v'sheker v'lo sisava b'dibur echad nemru. The problem with this is, the Pnei Yehoshua says, well, if you think about it, you have to recount the famous midrashim that talk about the differences, not in adding a word or leaving out a word, but rather switching words. And the most famous example is it says in Yisro, Zachar Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho, then it says in Veschanan, Shomoros Yom. So which one is it? It says Lo Sachmod, and then it says Lo Sisaveh in Veschanan. So the answer is it was said B'dibur Echad. It was said at the same time. That's why some are mentioned some way in Yisro, and some are mentioned some way in Veschanan. That's only when the point is there, but there's one word that's different, and therefore you could interchange them like Shamor and Zachar. Like I just mentioned, Shamar or Zachar. But that's a great introduction. But what does that have to do with us? You can't tell me this nice pshetel, right, when it comes to Laman Yitav, because that's something that just isn't mentioned. It's completely left out. So it's not b'dibarecha nemru, it's just left out. That's a different discussion. Because it says Laman Yarichun Yamecha in Yisro, it says Laman Yarichun Yamecha in Veschanan, but it doesn't say Laman Yarichun Ulaman Yitavlach in Yisro. It just says that in Veschanan, so there's an extra word of Yitav. Od matzati shekadosh baruch hu ba'atzmo higid shnei pa'amim haseres hadibur barishona. Then he says he found another medrash that in fact Hashem did say yes, both haseres hadibros. And he goes on, and I'm just going to skip a little. He brings down, just to give you a highlights, he brings down the machlokes in the Yerushalmi about whether they were 5 and 5, right? We have a classic Aseres Dibros, one tablet with 5, the second tablet with 5. The truth is, he brings down a shita in the Yerushalmi that says 10 and 10. Okay? If it all came from God, then it should be only once, right? But if you say that the Dibros were 10 on one side and 10 on the other side, and then God must have said it twice. Okay? And he goes on. Now, what does it have to do with our Gemara? This is a very beautiful introduction as to the differences between the first lashon and the second lashon. And then he goes on to say, Lefize Yuvan Devade Rab Chia Barabba Yada Shapir Debus Harishonos Lo Nemer Behen Tov. Of course, and our Gemara and Baba Kama Rab Chia knew very well that in Yisro it doesn't say Tov. Kifi haksuvim shalafanenu. Avamasha hiksha Rab Chia. Why did he ask Rab Chia then? How come it's not written? Dafka al hashinu delaman yitavlach. Right? He only had this one specific question. Why is laman yitavlach added? He didn't ask a question of shamar and zachar or lo sachmar and lo sisave. Mashma mishum de b'kol hashinuyim amrinan sheshnei nemur pi HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because in both renditions, both were said mi pi HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'nichtevu k'tzasam berishonos u'k'tzasam b'achronos, and some made it to the first set, some made it to the second set. Masha enken b'laman yitavlach. But for some reason, laman yitavlach never made it to the first set. Shehu chesaron hanikar. That's something that's obviously missing. So kashalo, that's what really bothered him. Lama lo nemru be'emes mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Is it that God didn't say it? And part B, v'im nemru, and if God did say it, lama lo nechtevu, then why wasn't it written? So that's what his question was. So that's what Rav Chia says when he says, Eini yodea im nemar, he says, I don't know if it was said. So the Pnei Yoshua is medayik from the word ne'emar. When he says the word ne'emar means im ne'emru mipi hagvura. So his answer was, you know what the answer to your question is? Not that I don't know if it was written. Of course I know. Of course I know the psukim. I don't know if it was said from God, v'hacheseron hu b'ksiva. It was said from God, but for whatever reason, it never made it to the second edition in Parshas Veschanan. O shehachesaron hu ba'amira. Or the chesaron was in the amira, it was never said at all. And that's how he describes it, and it's a very beautiful explanation of this Gemara. Okay, so that's one way of understanding this specific Gemara, and it's interesting. Just there's the Gilyon Hashash Rabbi Kiva Eger says this Gemara shouldn't be, again, this is the Pnei Yoshua has a whole, which he doesn't characteristically do. If you know the Pnei Yoshua, he always defends Rashi against questions on Tosfos. Here, he's coming up with this chiddush that he usually doesn't talk about on aggadata, but here the Pnei Yoshua talks about the aggadata. And the other thing you should know is that the Rabbi Akiva Eger says, no, take this Gemara literally, that it's possible, right? Unlike that opinion we saw in the Ene Yitzchak, excuse me, similar to the opinion that we saw in the Ene Yitzchak, that in fact, these rabbis sometimes did not know psukim. And there's a Gemara in Bava Basra. Tosfos actually in Bava Basra says that yes, it is true. On Daf Kuf Yud Gimel, there's a discussion about how a pasuk is written regarding Parshas Pinchas in the Nachalus, and Tosfos actually comments there that yes, it is possible that they weren't sure what words were used in a pasuk. So to us, we're like, how could they not know, the Bible by heart, right? You would think that that's something that's a no-brainer, but leave it to the Gemara and the Rishonim and Achronim to, stir up the pot as to how much we take it literally that they didn't know, or no, of course they knew, but there's something much deeper. Okay, so that's one Gemara. I wanted to read another section on Daf Hey. Gemara on back to Avodah Zarah. I'm going to take another snippet. A very interesting Gemara, which is very complex and hard to understand. If you remember Daf Hey, which I believe was yesterday's Daf, says the following: Amar Reish Lakish. Let me just find it. Amar Reish Lakish. Bo v'nachzik tov v'lavosenu. I'm about 15 lines down in the Gemara on Daf Hey Amar Aleph, 5a in Avodah Zarah. Says Reish Lakish, let us be happy for our forefathers. She'el malehen lo chatu, anu lo banu la'olam. Thank God they sinned by the Chet HaEgel. Because if they did not sin, we wouldn't be here today. Shenemar, ani amarti Elohim atem uvnei adam kulchem. Okay? I said that you were like God and you'd live forever. Chavalta ma'asechem. You sinned. Achen ka'adam temusun. Thank God they sinned, and now we could die, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's what the Gemara says. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? You're going to tell me that if they didn't sin, we wouldn't lo have a moldy? We wouldn't be born? But it says pruvu. Okay, so the Gemara goes back and forth, but let's just rewind for a second. Let's make sure we understand the statement. Says Reish Lakish, thank God that they sinned, because if they didn't, they'd live forever and there'd be no future generations. So they took one for the team by sinning so that the Jewish people could continue. That's a very, very difficult statement to make. Now, but the Gemara actually takes it literally. I want to focus. There's a lot of things to talk about that Gemara. I wanted to focus on Tosfos. Tosfos takes the Gemara literally. He takes it so literally that Tosfos asks the question. Says Tosfos, V'yafagav darmiyan and deperakama de erevin. Tosfos says, hold on a second. You're telling me that because they sinned, we are now in the world? But doesn't the Gemara say, Adaf Yud Gimel, Nimnu v'gamru noach lo la'adam shalo nivra? Right? Isn't it better not to be born than to be born? So why is that a bad thing? Right? Meaning, yes, they sinned. But after all, right, it would have been better if we wouldn't have been born. So why are we so happy that we're around? The ultimate level is not to be around. What does that mean? Well, what the Gemara is referring to, what Tosfos is referring to, a debate between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Okay, so we're going to see that in a second. Okay, but first, I want to point out something in the Tosfos. So that's Tosfos's question. Tosfos's answer is, before we get to the Gemara, Tosfos's answer was, well, Hainu b'tchilas lidaso she'en yadua ma yeh b'sofo. That discussion about it's better not to be born, it's better to be born, is only, right, if you don't know what's going to happen to a person. But if you know what's going to happen, then obviously it's better to be born if you're a tzaddik. Okay? Now, there's many problems with this Gemara. First of all, the Ein Yaakov, right? We're back to the Ein Yaakov. He says, well, look at who's talking. Who's talking is Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, who chazar b'tshuva. He was known as the biggest Baal Tshuva in all of Shas. The story of Reish Lakish and of Yochanan, right? So therefore, that says the Ein Yaakov, b'makom shabali tshuva omdim ein tzadikim gumur yochol lamud. He was on the highest level. So az b'vadei noach lo shenivra. So that's why he could make the statement. Only Reish Lakish could make the statement that thank God that we're born. Okay, so that's one way to look at this statement. It's a very, very complex, misunderstood statement because you have to understand where it's coming from. This is coming from, let me open it up, a Gemara in Eruvin Daf Yud Gimel. Why is this Gemara in Eruvin and what's it all about? So I wanted to focus on this. Yud Gimel Amud Beis. The Gemara actually is talking about the historical machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel and why we hold like Beis Hillel as opposed to Beis Shammai. Okay, the Gemara says, well, the reason why we hold like Beis Hillel is because they actually let Beis Shammai speak first, and they happen to be just nicer people, right? If you really want to know. That's why we hold like Beis Hillel. Okay, I'm reading on Eruvin 13b. Tana Rabbanan. 10 lines from the bottom on Eruvin Yud Gimel Amud Beis. Shtei shanu umechza nechlaku Beis Shammai uBeis Hillel. There was a 2.5-year debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Halalu omrim Noach lo Adam shelo nivra yoter mishenivra. These, now, who's the first opinion? The first opinion is usually Beis Shammai. The first opinion said, better not to be born, okay, than to be born. The Halalu Omer Beis Hillel said, no, it's better to be born than not to be born. Nimna v'gamru. Nimna v'gamru means that they tallied up the votes at the end of the day, and they said, no, adam shelo nivra. Wow, at the end of the debate, they all unanimously held, better not to be born. Wow. But achshav shenivra, but as they say in Yiddish, tochas afem tish, right? At the end of the day, lamaisa, that we're around, we got to do something. You can't be born and then say, well, better not to be born. If you're not born, then that's one thing. But now that we're born, now that we're around, we got to make something of our life. So therefore, yipashbesh b'maisav, v'amila yimashbesh b'maisav. We have to do the best that we can. Okay? We have to, as Rashi says, yibdok ba'averos shebiyado v'yisvada v'yashuv. We have to do the best, and if we sin, we got to do tshuva. Okay, very, very beautiful. What does this Gemara mean? Very, very, very difficult to understand. And the only reason why we're talking about it, right, is because Tosfos brought it as a question to our Gemara about Reish Lakish saying that thank God that we sinned, right? Because if we didn't sin, nobody would be around, which is obviously a contradiction to this Gemara that says, well, why is it so bad not to be around? After all, both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that it's better not to be around. So I want to quote, first we'll do a rare Rav Nachman from Breslov in his Likutei Moharan. He says, Masha Amru Chazal Noach Lo Adam Shelo Nivra Yoter Misha Nivra, right? And then he, like a lot of commentators, such as Rav Yaakov Emden, in the Gemara and in Eruvin, asked a very elementary question. You're telling me that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai had this debate? You had to go back to Koheles. Koheles himself had this debate. So what in the world is Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel arguing about if this was settled in the fourth chapter of Koheles? And the Rav Nachman from Breslov asked the same question. He says, "V'chen mashakasu v'tov mishneim es asher aden lo haya." Doesn't the pasuk say better both of these than someone who hasn't been born yet? Hadavar tamua. He says this is very, very, very difficult to understand. V'im ken alma nivra. If that's the case, that it's better not to be born. You don't think God knew this debate, right? This Gemara. So why the heck are we born? Why are we around? Says the Nachman in Breslov. Ubavadai ein hadvarim ne'emarim ki im ba'olam hazeh. This was only said from a standpoint of olam hazeh. Shekafit tzaros olam hazeh v'hayisurin shesovlim b'nei adam b'zeh olam kol echad ve'echad. From the standpoint that everybody in this world is suffering, then I agree with you. B'vadai haya tov yoter im lo haya nivra klal. If you want a Monday morning quarterback and look back at someone's particular life that suffered and went through all this, then obviously you could say it's better he or she never made it into the world. But from the standpoint of Olam Haba, then it's certainly better that we were created, because then we have our merits that help us make it up there. Right? Ki al yedei zeh daika ba'in el hatachlis. V'gam afilu b'olam haza yafa sha'achas b'tshuva ma'asim tovim b'olam haza mikol chaya olam haba. And then he ends off by saying 1 hour of tshuva in this world is better than an entire life in the world to come. Okay, so that's one explanation. I want to focus on a couple of things. First of all, let's look at the Maharsha and Makos. Okay, the Maharsha and Makos, believe it or not, not here, but in the end of Makos has a very, very long essay on this, and I want to read a little bit because it's really beautiful. The Maharsha says, "Ulefi she'ilu lo nivra ha'adam lo haya bo ma'isa." Here's the way the Maharsha says you have to think about this Gemara. He says, if a person wasn't born, then nothing would happen, right? There wouldn't be anything, there wouldn't be schar, and there wouldn't be hefsid, meaning you wouldn't be doing mitzvahs, you wouldn't be doing good deeds, but on the other hand, you wouldn't be sinning either. You'd be neutral. The halavin havay vaday miskaimin. You would certainly be mekayim all the lavim. You would not be doing sins, guaranteed. Right? Lulei nivra, the hashta shenivra. Now that a person is around, efshar shelo yizke v'yavar halavin. Now there's a good chance that you could sin. Nimtza mafsed bibriyoso. So therefore you're at a net loss. V'ha'asin hu ha'hepech. That's when it comes to mitzvahs lo taseh. When it comes to the mitzvahs aseh, it's the opposite. She'ilu lo nivra, if you weren't born, vade lo haya miskaimin. You definitely wouldn't be you wouldn't be doing the positive commandments. V'hashta shenivra efshar sheyizkeh. Now that you're around, there's a possibility that you could be doing good deeds. So you could be doing bad deeds or you could be doing good deeds. V'yasev v'nimtza shehad niskar. And you could be profiting by doing mitzvos. V'hashta pligi mitzad briyoso. So if that's true, what's going on in this debate between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is almost a question of mathematics. The machlokus is chad amar tov lo shelo nivra mitzad halavin. It's better to be not around because chances are you'll be doing lavin. Efshar sheyeh nifsad yoter mishenivra ve'ikayim hasin. Denimtza yatsa schara behefsedo. Whatever good deeds you're going to do, the bad deeds are going to counteract that. And the bad deeds are going to neutralize the good deeds. That's if you want to call it the glass half empty. Let's look at the glass half full. V'chad amar tov lo shenivra she'efshar sheyikayim ha'asin. Yeah, but isn't it good that you're around now so that you could do good deeds? Mishalo nivra v'yikayim halav, and rather not to be around, and the only benefit you get from not being around, for not existing, is that you're not sinning, right? Diyatza hefsed b'scharo. The Amar Bazeh. So we have this philosophical debate. If you are not around, if you don't exist, on the one, how do we look at it? Great, you not exist because you can't do Averos, or it's a shame you don't exist because now you can't do positive mitzvos. That's what this whole discussion is about. This is unbelievable. Says the Maharsha, Amar Bazeh the Nimnu v'Gamru. So how does the Gemara end off? At the end of the day, Ratzalom Sheba'u Bezalel Minyan HaMitzvos. So Beis Shammai and Bezalel said, you know what? Let's count the 613 mitzvos. What are there more? Oh, there's 365 no's and there's 248 yeses. Shahalavim hem yoter mahaseis. There are more lavim than aseis. V'alkarchach hiskimu v'gamru lomar shelo nivra ha'adam b'shvil atzmo. Therefore, what? V'yoter hayatov lo shelo nivra ki hu karav lahefsed. Machmas halavin. This is all math. Because there are more lavim, then statistically, that's the key word over here, statistically, there's a better chance of you committing a lav than by doing an asay. Therefore, don't take the chance and don't be around. Ki hu karav lahefsed machmas halavim shehem rabim. V'rochok l'schar mitzad ha'asin, and you have a worse chance of doing a positive mitzvah shehem muwatin, because it's 20% less. So therefore, if you figure out the math, there's a 20% chance greater of you committing a lo taseh than a lav. But at the end of the day, we're here, and we're only here because of kavod hamakom. Shenemar lechvodi barasiv, and now he goes on and on and on, but there's a beautiful explanation as to what in the world this debate is, right? Very, 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 very deep, a little bit lumdish, but I hope you enjoyed that one. I wanted to end off by looking at the psukim in Koheles. Says the pasuk, let me open it up. In the last 5 minutes, the pasuk says, Tanakh. I am chapter 4 in Koheles, verse 2. V'shabeach aniyas hamesim shikvar mesu. This is a pasuk that we all know, and I'm glad we brought it up because any excuse to learn Koheles, I always take advantage of because it happens to be my favorite. Especially this is very, very, this unfortunately is a very, very, bitter, pasuk. But he basically says, Shlomo Melech says, he says, the dead are more fortunate who have died than those who are living, mina chayim, asher hema chayim adena. Right? It's more fortunate to be dead than to be alive. And in Pasuk Gimel, he says, V'tov mishnehem, and if you're keeping score, it's what's better than both of these, es asher aden lo haya, one that hasn't even been born yet. Asher lo ra es ha'maaseh hara, someone who is so fortunate not to see what's going on in the world today. Asher nasa tachas hashamash. I mean, talk about, timely events as usual, right? This pasuk, I can't think of a more fitting pasuk, right? Better not to see what's going on in this world. That is better than someone who is A, living, and B, someone who lived and is now dead. So I have to read the Ibn Ezra on this. There's an unbelievable Ibn Ezra, and he says as following. He says, "V'shabeach aniyas hamesim shekvar mesu." He says, "V'zeh ha'inyan she'amar shehamesim yoter mishubachim min hachayim." You know why it's better to be dead than living? Who keneged ha'ashukim, those who are oppressed. Shekol adam yakabel ma kol ma sheyavo alav min hashamayim. A person should be able to reasonably take every ailment and punishment that is gozer from Shemayim. V'lo yuchal lisbol oshek sheyaselo ben adam shu kamohu. The only thing he can take is if it comes from someone who's equal. Wow. Right? And I actually found a translation because the Ibn Ezra is sometimes very, very hard to understand in English. So I'm gonna read the someone actually wrote a very good English Ibn Ezra on Koheles. He says when Koheles says that the dead are to be praised more than the living, he speaks of of the oppressed. A person will bear anything that comes to him from heaven. Right? Sounds a little bit like Viktor Frankl. Except for the oppression that a person who is his equal places upon him. In such a case, he will choose death over life. Okay, that's Pasuk Bet. In Pasuk Gimel, remember what he says? He says, let me go back. He says in Pasuk Gimel, he says, B'tov Mishnehen, says the Ebenezer, he says, והעניין שהמסים שמסו כפר מצה מנוח ולא שמו כל נוגו שטוב מן החיים והמסים אשר לא נבראו עתה בעבור היוס העשוקים בגופן. You know, I'm going to read it in English because we have 1 minute left. He says, this pasuk, excuse me, he says, but better than they both. The word aden is a compound verb. Okay, the meaning of the verse is, the dead who have passed away have already found rest and do not hear the voice of the oppressor. Koheles says that those who were never born are better off than the living and the dead, because though alive, are physically oppressed, such as prisoners or captives or those who suffer economic oppression. As for the dead, even though they now no longer exist, they too suffered from oppression while alive. So now, as that is the introduction, Koheles asks the ultimate existential question. He says, how can Koheles say that one who never existed, right, but better is one who never existed, right? He brings our Gemara. He says, doesn't it say, happy is he who was never born? Right? Meaning he's asking a very, very, right, what we call a paradox. The paradox is, how could the Gemara say that Tov lo shel never, it's better not to be born, or happy is the one not born, but if he never existed, then how could he be happier than somebody, right, who is born? A person never born, right, doesn't experience happiness. How does a person who's never born can compare himself, or what would you have done? Like I always say, if I was around in the 60s, I would have seen this, I would have enjoyed this, I would have enjoyed that. The bottom line is I have no idea how I would have been because I wasn't around. So too over here. The Ibn Ezra asks the ultimate, right, paradox is how could a person be considered happier not to be born, right? If an unborn person can't be happy, he can't express that happiness. Great question. So the Ibn Ezra answers, in reality, the above does not present any problem, for it is the nature of language to speak in metaphors because of the inability of language to describe reality. It's a metaphor. It's not taken literally. And he ends off by saying, I'll say it in Hebrew first. He says, Ve'eno tameh ba'avur kotzer halashon ledavar ki im al haderech dimyonos, metaphors, kamosha yomru chachmei shikol hadas. He quotes the philosophers. He says the following philosophy, and this you could write a whole book on. Ki kol davar hu yesh o ayin. Something either exists or does not exist. V'im hu davar echu ayin. Right? So in the end, he asks this question. He says again, everything either exists or does not exist. So if something exists, how can you say that it does not exist? Right? It's either exists or it doesn't. There's nothing in the middle. Again, many philosophers have tackled this discussion, not for now, but this is the way he at least tries to explain this pasuk, not to be taken literally, because obviously someone who is not around, not alive, can't express happiness. So sorry to end on such a deep note that we can't talk about more, but if you want to look at it, it's Koheles Perek Dalid Pasuk Beis and Gimel. All right. Good night.